because popular culture and particularly the detective fiction thing needs a lot of attention. In fact, people who are casually interested, people who would like to research on this, or people who would like to think about this in a little more detailed. So this, the presentation, the lecture that I'm going to give is essentially a kind of a primer for them, just a point of introduction. And there would be some spoilers, I'm afraid. So spoiler warning at the very beginning. And I would also like to keep it within, say, 45 minutes or so. Let's see. I tend to go on tangents a lot. Hopefully that is something that I will not be doing this rainy afternoon, evening-ish time. And see, I specifically mentioned detective story because the issue of crime is a much larger issue. Crime fiction is a dedicated genre, but crime is there in all forms of literature somehow or the other. So crime is something that we talk about a lot in a lot of other points, but the area that I am going to engage in, talk about, is specifically those stories which involve a detective figure. Now, of course, the detective figure is there to help us, is there to guide us through a narrative, a mystery, and the detective figure is also there to kind of show off his or her intelligence, because there is always a race between the detective figure and the reader or the audience, because we also tend to think that we will be able to solve the crime, perhaps along with the detective or before the detective, but the detective story writer always tries to foil our efforts. If it's a good story, as we perceive it, if it's a good narrative, then we are surprised at the end, and it seems quite rational that our mistakes were because we do not have the intelligence or the training or the insight that a detective figure might have. That's why that figure is a detective and we are but readers. I'm quite sure we all want to be detectives. If you are Bengali, then Feluda would be, or Bomkesh would be, a kind of an icon that we would like to follow. But there is the other issue as well. It's a strange, it's not really strange, but it's a curious and a sociologically interesting fact that we are fascinated by crime. Crime, and when we are talking about crime, if the crime is ordinary, we are not interested. A simple theft will not interest us. It will have to be something grand, a very mysterious murder. One of the most, within the detective story genre, there is one subsection called the closed door murder stories, and they fascinate us even more because the crime apparently seems impossible, and it is for the detective to find out how the impossible was done. So here we have the intelligence of the detective on the one hand, and we have the intelligence of the criminal on the other hand, because a detective story is basically a game playing between the perpetrator of the crime and the people who are trying to catch the perpetrator. So that tussle, that competition is something that we tend to enjoy, and quite often, and there are, if the criminal is a hero, then we want the detective to fail. And if the detective is a hero, obviously we are quite happy when the detective succeeds. There are certain issues, and also there is this issue of judgment. The audience also becomes the judge. This is a point that I will come back to later on. Not to bore you very briefly, but this is something. And there is this idea of voyeurism. There is this idea of power play, because the detective is definitely a figure of power, but as long as the crime is unsolved, the power remains with the criminal. So there is a very interesting exchange of power between the detective and the criminal, and it's the game element there. And the game element you need to remember, because let me say it at the very beginning, that when somebody is murdered and the detective is trying to unravel the mystery, we seldom, rarely, if ever, care about the victim. We do not care about the death. We do not really think about the consequences of that death. What we care about is the game that will be played. And the victim merely becomes, well, the thing that we complain, that humanity has become just a number for the newspapers or for the structure that rules us. Just like that, the victim also becomes an element in the text, somebody who needed to get murdered. So we don't really give the victim that much consideration or thought. So our entire focus is on the game. If there are other murders, still then you kind of concern yourself with the ingenuity of the murder rather than the human pathos that the loss of human life should associate with such an event. So anyway, and that is probably why for a very long time detective fiction was not taken seriously. I mean, not the only reason, there are plenty of other reasons along with that, but the human value is something that definitely has a different kind of presence in the detective story. So for a long time the critics just took a thought of this whole thing rather casually. They did not want to give it any canonical status. They did not, the critical establishment did not really talk about detective fiction as such. Our syllabi had detective fiction only recently. So we are paying attention to a lot of things that were non-canonical, and within that the detective fiction genre falls. It is still in the margins of canon, still in the periphery. So we are, I don't know how seriously we are still taking this. But anyway, there are lots of issues that are canon formation, etc. There are a lot of issues. There are lots of quotations which I can give you, that people thought that detective stories are basically a sleight of hand, a kind of a trick, a magic trick kind of a thing. So it does not demand, or it does not deserve the critical attention that we at the moment are trying to give to this genre. Of course, when we talk about Sherlock Holmes, yes, I know the literary value of Sherlock Holmes is rather slender, but there are other issues that can be looked at, and let me just talk about that for a while. But before I do that, let me give you a disclaimer. What I will not be talking about, because there is not much, I mean, this would take a lot of time then, perhaps later on someday. I'm not going to talk about women detectives. We have in our University of Calcutta syllabus Alexander McCall Smith's #1 ladies detective agency. That is a modern kind of a take on the detective story, a very different kind of a take. But the entire idea of the female detective is something that needs separate critical discussion. And not today, I am afraid. I am sorry for that. And I am not really going to talk about Miss Marple. I will limit my discussion to male detectives, because even now, even in the 21st century, detective fiction is tremendously gender biased. It's still a male dominated kind of genre. So with this in mind, let me just talk about the genre. I mean, there are several kinds of detective stories. Even within the detective story genre, there are so many kinds. Like there is a whodunit, there is the thriller, there is the suspense plot kind of a thing, right? A whodunit. These all have different narrative strategies. That's how these are differentiated, particularly by Zvetan Todorov, the Bulgarian French critic. He is the one who had first looked at the detective fiction thing, and he had critically dealt with all these differences, kind of a taxonomy that he was creating, the generic differences that he was looking at. So, and thrillers are something that we enjoy, like James Bond or something like that. There are so many thrillers around. We don't really need a specific detective figure in a thriller. There might be, there might not be. In all these three separate forms that I mentioned, in the whodunit, in the thriller, in the suspense plot, there might be a detective figure, there might not be. So even some of Sherlock Holmes's adventures might be called thrillers. I mean, at least a thriller-like. There are a few suspense plots, but the whodunits, where the narrative goes backwards, the crime has been committed, reconstruction of the crime happens. Whodunit is also where we move along with the detective. It's not like a short story where the process is a part of it. But anyway, that's not the thing that I'm going to talk about today. And within the detective fiction, historically, we have had many different kinds of detectives. We have had the gentleman detective like Sherlock Holmes, as I mentioned, gentleman detective who is also a consulting detective, as Holmes calls himself, the world's first consulting detective. And there are the hard-boiled and soft-boiled. Both things are there. In particularly when we approach the noir tradition in Hollywood or America, if you read Dashiell Hammett, if you read Raymond Chandler, then you know there are these very hard-boiled detective figures where morality doesn't really have a space. Right and wrong, they are all gone topsy-turvy. Even the detective often does things which are, if not immoral, they are amoral. So such things happen in these. And of course we have the cozy or tea-cozy mysteries. Particularly Agatha Christie, Miss Marple would fall into that category. To a certain extent, you might even, if you stretch it a little, put Poirot in that as well, because he is the ultimate gentleman detective. Gentleman to the fact, I mean, Sherlock Holmes does get his hands dirty at times, but Poirot abhors anything physical as such. And that is one of the reasons why I hated the new, although I like Kenneth Branagh as such, but his new Poirot is something that I could not really digest, to use a rather Bengali proverbial term. And of course the classic detectives, there are overlapping ideas here. The classic detective stories are there. And of course, in the recent times, more popular rather in the recent times, they have been there for a while, police procedurals, where the detective is a policeman, belongs to the police force. That has become rather popular. In fact, I was just, before starting this discussion, before logging in, I was thinking about it, and all the famous detective figures that I could think of were mostly police people. And I again will be ending my discussion with this. So the noir thing I have mentioned, so all these categories are there. And also, there has been this division of the highbrow and the lowbrow. But then again, highbrow and lowbrow are time specific. Something that was considered lowbrow then would be very highbrow. Most of you would not know of this thriller series in Bengali. There was this Deepak Chatterjee Dragon series, which was considered completely lowbrow because they were impossible. There were so many incredibly atrocious, irrational ideas that we laughed at them. But now, even though people don't really know of them, we have kind of a fond memory of those books, and they're good reading, good fun, as we like to call it. And see, all these distinctions, they kind of point towards a lot of socio-economic issues, because when I'm talking about the noir, you can see the contemporary depression, the economic depression that was ruling the times, that you can actually see in these texts. When you look at Sherlock Holmes, you will see how the Sherlock Holmes adventures, you get to see the time in that. Crime is the other face, isn't it? I mean, you have, incidentally, Pride and Prejudice, I was just going to say talk about Pride and Prejudice. There is a book called Murder Comes to Pemberley, where Darcy seems to become the detective. But anyway, I have completely forgotten the name of the author. Maybe one of you could remember. Now, alright, so lowbrow and highbrow, and that kind of changes. Something that was lowbrow might become highbrow. I mean, Raymond Chandler would not be as highbrow at that time as we think of him now. Brilliant narratives. Dashiell Hammett, if you look at Nick and Nora Charles, they are so incredibly entertaining. Or there are hard-boiled detectives that we have from that time as well. Now, but before I get on to, let me just get into the thing now. If we look at the history of detection, this is a question that I always ask. It's a question that I will not be answering. I will be suggesting certain things, but I would like you to think about it. Why does all of a sudden we have this emergence of detective fiction? Basically, 1819, some people say, is the beginning, because E.T.A. Hoffman's, it's called Mademoiselle de Scudéry is the book, which is supposedly one of the first instances. Of course, we know in Edgar Allan Poe, the murder in Rue Morgue, which is 1841. This is the time when the gentleman detective, the detective figure, comes in. And what we need to understand is that this is the time when the structured sense of law and order is also beginning. For a long time, for a very long time, there were no police forces. Soldiers used to keep the peace as such. Magistrate soldiers, and that kind of a system was there. We have the first structured police system in around the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century. Even the Metropolitan Police Force in England, it's starting around that time. I don't remember the exact date. And if I am not mistaken, one of the first proper police forces is being established, one of the first in the empire, that is, in the British Empire, in Kolkata. Kolkata is getting one of the first proper police forces in Lal Bazar. So, and it's not that far back if you think about it, 1860 or something like that. I am not very sure, I might be mistaken. This is completely from memory, and with age my memory is becoming rather grey. So anyway, now I told you that detective stories have not had a lot of critical attention in the past. But one gentleman who has been talking about everything had also talked about detective fiction. This gentleman, you know, he is someone called T.S. Eliot. He was planning to write a book on detective fiction, which he thankfully did not. And he has a lot of things to say, and I will come to that in the next section of the discussion. So basically, T.S. Eliot said that no, it's the The Moonstone, Vicky Collins's The Moonstone, that is the first proper detective novel. Even though people say that it's Edgar Allan Poe who is the first proper detective in the sense that we understand the term now, the gentleman consulting private detective. So that proper detective thing, and we have with him the proper process of detection. So that, and of course Poe is very literary, his literary flavor cannot be denied, and we then have Sherlock Holmes, who is somewhat inspired from Auguste Dupin, and of course that is where the private detective also begins. Along with the police detectives, the private detective also comes into play. And this is the other question that you need to ask. If we have the police, if we have the police detectives, why do we need a private detective? What socio-cultural function does this private detective play, does offer? I mean, what does he do? What is his role in this thing? Is the private detective a challenge to the structure? That we all know that we don't really pay as much respect to the police as we should. Not to the corruption, but to the general idea of policing. It's the coercion, it's the violence that we pay attention to, not the logic or the law. But the private detective is a kind of an answer from the general population, and that is why the general population was far more intrigued by the presence of the private detective, that the private detective does not belong to the structure. The private detective comes from the ordinary populace, the private populace, not the public servants, and the private detective solves the cases that the public servants cannot. So in a way, this is where the population wins over the structure. So this is something to think about. Again, I am not going to impose my ideas on you. This is something that you might want to think about. And later on, in the mid 20th century, we have this shift. We have a lot of police detectives. We have people like Perry Mason, in fact, who is a lawyer who is solving cases. Not only cases in the court, but as a detective he is functioning. We have Maigret, for instance. We have a lot of discussions on Maigret now. Maigret and his almost existential brand of Sivinon's almost existential brand of presentation. So Maigret, and very interestingly, you would, if you have not seen already, you would find, I found it very interesting that in the televised Maigret serial, the person who played Maigret was Rowan Atkinson, in a very different avatar from Mr. Bean. This is a very serious, very Maigret-ish kind of a person that he plays. It's a wonderful thing, and it's a very procedural kind of a thing. So Maigret, we have Inspector Morse by Colin Dexter, we have P.D. James's Inspector Dalglish, and so on and so forth. So there are so many instances of the detective that we are supporting switching to the structure side. We are no longer having faith in the private detective as much as we did. Don't think in terms of Mithun Mashi or Feluda. Think in terms of a very global kind of cultural kind of a logistical thing, because Mithun Mashi and Feluda are more romances than detective stories proper. So again, don't throw stuff at me for saying this. Byomkesh is much more detective kind of a thing. But anyway, so and the thing that I would mostly like to talk about, my title of the presentation is Detective Story from Super to Man. This super thing, these super figures, because if you think about Agatha Christie, along with Poirot and Miss Marple, Christie also created 3 other series. One is the Harley Quinn series, one is the Parker Pine series, the other one is the Tommy and Tuppence series. So they are not proper detectives as such, but they involve themselves in a lot of crime related activity and they solve these activities. So ultimately a kind of detection. They are adventurers or problem solvers or something like that. And interestingly, what we have here is that, for instance, Parker Pine is described as a rather fat. Christie says he's large, not fat, and he has a bald head of noble proportions, and he doesn't look a genius, he doesn't act like a genius, there are no quirks or anything in his figure. Rather, he has, as Christie says, an aura of dependability. So this dependability is very, very significant, right? And of course, when Thomas Beresford of Tommy and Tuppence is described, Christie clearly writes that he is not exceptional. In fact, if I might read from that particular quotation, Tommy Beresford was one of those Englishmen not distinguished by any special intellectual ability, but who are emphatically at their best in what is known as a tight place. So this clear demarcation that these are not special people is something that Christie was delving in, and these books were rather popular at that time. But if you think about it, at this point of time, how many people would even know about Tommy and Tuppence? Or, I mean, if I was not, to be perfectly honest, if I was not looking into it from a rather critical point, rather research oriented point of view, even I might not have found out about them. I would have been, I would have only known of Poirot and Miss Marple. So but Christie has this range. In fact, if you think about it, Conan Doyle had written so much more than Sherlock Holmes. How many of those stories people actually end up reading, the non-Sherlock Holmes stories? Conan Doyle had written as many, just as many if not more, about other issues, novels and short stories, but we only end up remembering Sherlock Holmes. And this is something that I'll come to, because see, let me come to that in fact right now. Holmes and Poirot, my focus would be Christie, but let me just still talk about the two of them, because you can't really talk about Poirot without talking about Holmes. What we have here is a process in which you need a second person present, a faithful narrator, someone through whose eyes we will look at the detective. The detective will not directly tell you what is happening. It's the same paradigm that we have in Byomkesh and Feluda. That the detective will not be telling you what is happening from his own point of view, but there would be another voice who would be looking admiringly at the detective, who would be telling you that the detective is such a great man. In fact, the detective is such a superman. And this is where, but this is not something that we have in the case of Miss Marple. She is not looked at as a superwoman. But anyway, that's a different idea to explore altogether. But these supermen, and of course, the other question that I have, and I have asked a lot of people because my memory, as I said, is not really good. Sherlock Holmes is a consulting detective, so is Poirot, because they take money for the cases. As private detectives, they are paid. Miss Marple, does she get paid for her adventures, for her detections? Does she get cases like that? How often does she get that? Or is she looked at this very genial, nosy grandmother kind of a figure, who is the charm being that such a figure is solving cases? So it's an extremely gender biased kind of a response that we are looking at here. But anyway, and the detective becomes almost omniscient. The detective knows everything. The detective will at the necessary point will come up with a knowledge, and the detective would kind of cheat you, because you can't possibly know everything that the detective seems to know. You can't possibly have access. You can't possibly have access to all the information that the detective seems to have. And the stooge figure, as is called, because they are ordinary people, but compared to the detective, they look absolutely dull. Watson in the new avatar in Sherlock is much better, but the Watson who is writing in Conan Doyle, that Watson often has so idiotic kind of theories. And of course, speaking of idiocy, Colonel Hastings, when he is talking about Poirot, is also often ends up having rather weird conclusions. So, but the other thing that you have is that both Poirot and Holmes, they have characters which has certain quirks. You know, Sherlock Holmes is, as Sherlock said recently, Sherlock is a high-functioning sociopath. He is not normal by any definition. Even if you look, even if you don't want to read it, if you can find, if you see the Granada television series with Jeremy Brett, you will see how Sherlock Holmes is definitely abnormal, definitely. And the cocaine addiction, the 7-point solution, or that particular novel that spoke about Freud and Holmes. But anyway, the point is there are so many quirks, and both these men are completely asexual. They are post-sexual perhaps, or asexual, I don't know. And their speciality, their quirks, they are designed to keep us distracted. Because if you start really thinking about all these cases, then you'd see they are quite impossible. Because the detective seems to be very sure of his conclusions, as presented by the narrator figure. The detective is very sure, and quite often what we have is the detective confronting a room full of people and saying that this man or this woman is a criminal, the culprit. And we end up not really questioning the final conclusion. We end up trusting the detective completely. Sometimes we see that the detective has given us the same information, has shared the information that he has seen, but it's the analysis of that information, or the resolution of that information, the rather inference of that information, that we cannot reach, because we are not detectives after all. But the final denouement is another narrative trope, that it all becomes the detective's narrative. The detective will narrate the entire incident, and he will make us see how the crime was committed. And there are certain issues that are followed, and we kind of start having faith. I mean, if you know that this is a Sherlock Holmes story, if you know that this is a Hercule Poirot story, you would not think that the detective will not succeed. And even if the detective fails, there are times, rare times, but there are exceptional cases in which the detective fails. That is fine. But the detective rarely ever makes a mistake. It never happens that at the end of the story, the police comes and says, no, you are wrong. No, this person is not the culprit. You are completely wrong. This never ever happens. So if the detective loses, then it's a criminal that we admire. But mistakes are never there. Even if the detective makes a mistake, he or she immediately realizes it and he corrects it. So the superness of the figure is something that we have faith in within fiction, of course. And in that fictional reality, we do not question the detective at all. And more importantly, the detective rarely questions himself in this particular case. Not herself, but himself. Herself is a different discussion, as I keep telling you. Now, I was talking about T.S. Eliot. So let me just give you some elements that Eliot had mentioned. He was apparently a great fan of Agatha Christie. Right, and he had written certain, in the Criterion, not in any other journal, but the Criterion, he had published an article where he had given us the outline for the ideal detective story. I mean, you could not stop T.S. Eliot from doing this. So he says he is following the Moonstone, and let me just give you the things that he mentions. He says the story must not rely upon elaborate and incredible disguises. So very Aristotelian. The hero must not fall. Must not be perfect, and the fall must not be too incredible. And the character and motives of the criminal should be normal. In the ideal detective story, we should feel that we have a sporting chance to solve the mystery ourselves. If the criminal is highly abnormal, an irrational element is introduced which offends us. And this is something that we all, I guess, agree with. Because if the chance is not given, I remember one story, I am not going to name it here because you'll laugh at me, where it was a Hindi film. So it was a good thriller, it was a good detective kind of a story. But at the end, when the murderer was shown, this man we had never seen before in the entire story. This man just comes out of the blue. He is introduced about 5 minutes before the finish of the story, and we are told that this man is the murderer. And I seriously felt cheated, because there was no way I could have known that this man, and that is a case of cheating, because you are not told, you are not given a chance to be suspicious of this man. So there is a second element. He further on says the story must not rely either upon occult phenomena or what comes to the same thing, upon mysterious and preposterous discoveries made by lonely scientists. Then it will become either a ghost story or a science fiction story. So that, of course, it has to remain on a realistic, rational level. Then he says elaborate and bizarre machinery is an irrelevance. Agreed. The detective should be highly intelligent but not superhuman. We should be able to follow his inferences and almost but not quite make them with me. And this is where things actually depart. The detectives end up being superhuman. I mean, if you think about Sherlock Holmes, the way he infers everything, the way the elementary thing works, it's impossible for an ordinary man to think. I mean, if you look at the left sleeve of a shirt and know that the man's grandfather had a limp, that's absolutely impossible. And Sherlock Holmes functioned almost to that kind of exaggerated prowess that nobody can actually know such things. And that is a kind of trick, that is a kind of impression that the author is trying to give us, that this is a man who is super, who has this almost supernatural, not in the supernatural sense, but he is just above nature, super. And of course, the other superness that we have is in the Nietzschean sense of the Übermensch, because these detectives, they consider themselves to be beyond normal morality. Because in many times we have seen that these detectives, they do stuff which are not entirely legal. Sherlock Holmes pretends to be other people, disguise something that we admire, but that is quite illegal. And then there are so many instances where these men, and the way they carry on investigation, I mean, if a private detective comes and starts to ask me questions, would I answer? Why would I answer? That person has no right, no legal right to question or investigate as such. There is a licensed detective thing. That's a different issue. But we don't really know whether Holmes, or I don't even know whether that system was, the system of licensing was there or not. But of course, being consulting detectives, they are quite often consulted by police people. So that gives them the kind of license that we are talking about. But generally, they go beyond the scope of normal human rights or ethics. Often, not always, but that is where, because they consider themselves above normal morality. Morality is not only sexual, morality is not only criminal. There are so many other areas in which ethics and morality function. The Nietzschean Übermensch figure does not need to be a part of the hard morality. I mean, just like hard immunity, there is a thing called hard morality. So the detective figure does not really need to do that. But let me come to Poirot. I've been speaking for a long time now, so I need to kind of start the end. Poirot, when Christie was creating Poirot, the first thing that she needed to do was to make him very different from Sherlock Holmes. Because Sherlock Holmes was already popular, people did not need another Sherlock Holmes. So she created this figure who is in many ways the opposite of the Sherlock Holmes construct. He is not physical. Sherlock Holmes fights when necessary. Sherlock Holmes disguises himself. He runs, he does a lot of things, but Poirot, definitely not. Poirot would shudder. And as I told you quite a few minutes back, that this is Kenneth Branagh when Poirot was chasing a criminal in a quite complicated kind of a structure in the murder on the Orient Express. I kind of could not take it anymore. I mean, the handlebar moustache was bad enough, but that was the last straw kind of a thing, because Poirot would never ever do physical exercise. As a gentleman, he completely detests that. And of course, the other thing that Poirot does not have is the general knowledge base that Holmes seems to have. He is not an Englishman. His language is different. He often does not understand a lot of English nuances, but he does not do deduction. His is a very different kind of an approach to any case, any crime, because he looks at connections. His approach is much more psychological. He is looking at the motive, he is trying to discover what he calls the psychology of the crime, what Christie calls the psychology of the crime, and the personality of the murderer. So that is where he is very different. He does gather clues. I mean, that is something that you have to do. He does a lot of what the process is called is abduction, not deduction. It's called abduction, because he is comprehensively gathering all the information, gathering all the psychological elements, and he is creating. It's a medical kind of metaphor, that symptoms. He is gathering all the symptoms together, and he is creating a hypothesis. Apparently he is finding out what is wrong with the scenario, and by doing that he will find out who is the culprit in this particular case. So the method is different, and see, quite often what we have is basically creative guesswork. It's conjecture. And the point is, I told you that the audience becomes the judge. Here, the point is to convince the audience. In most cases, evidence is not something that these detectives are trying to find. They are merely pleasing the audience. They are making sense to the audience. The legal establishment, I do not know. Because they say that this man is a murderer, this woman is a murderer, and it's for the police to find out the corroborating evidence, etc. Because mostly the guesswork, the challenge, and there is a confession that is obtained. And this is the major flaw, because the detective does not have the responsibility of punishing the culprit. The detective's job ends the moment the culprit is found. But the rest of the matter, it's not merely finding. The structure needs to be. That is where police procedurals become very different, because the detectives, along with finding the culprit, has to prove it in a court of law, not only to the reading public. So, I mean, obviously to the reading public, but along with that there is this consciousness that there would be a court of law where the proof, the solid proof, is to be presented. So that and this process of abduction does not really give us that evidence. And of course Poirot, incidentally, we know that Poirot was a refugee from Belgium, because he was running away from the persecution that was happening. And there are lots and lots of information about Poirot. Very recently there was a BBC reinvention of the Poirot figure, and the origin of Poirot was reinvented, and it is something that I could not really agree with. I mean, if you have seen it, you would know what I'm talking about. If you have not, I'm not going to give you that spoiler. It was tremendously unsatisfying, because Poirot was supposed to be a policeman. He was the head of the police or something like that in Belgium, and that's where he had that talent, that skill of detection in him. And so basically, when Christie is writing The Mysterious Affair at Styles, this is 1916, and he is talking about this figure who is very quirky. He is about 5 feet 4 inches, so very short by British standards. He has this immaculate sense of style. His moustache has a different narrative altogether. There are elaborate rituals. He would be very particular about his clothing. He loves order. He detests anything that resembles disorder. He is, as I said, almost asexual. Apart from Countess Vera Roshkov, I think her name was, Rosakov. There are no weaknesses that we see as far as a kind of a amorous kind of thing one might imagine. And lots of stories about Poirot, and interestingly, Poirot is the only fictional character who was given an obituary in the New York Times. This is fascinating. And the other fascinating thing is that Christie apparently hated Poirot. Christie called Poirot a detestable, bombastic, tiresome, egocentric little creep. So this is how Christie mentioned. Of course, this must have been, there are different dynamics. Now, just a few words about Roger Ackroyd. The primary thing about Roger Ackroyd is the idea of the unreliable narrator. Roger Ackroyd was probably the first Agatha Christie novel to be performed, to be adapted for the stage. It was later adapted for the cinema as well. In 1928, there is a stage version. The very famous, the legendary Charles Laughton played Poirot. It was called Alibi. And see, when we talk about the murder of Roger Ackroyd, and the case in point is we don't really care about Roger Ackroyd as such. We only care about this solving the crime. We don't really bother about that man. And here we have an absence of the regular narrator figure. The narrator is Dr. James Shepherd. And Dr. Shepherd is the one who is finding out that his neighboring house has been rented by someone, this curious Belgian. He doesn't understand who this man is. He has some other ideas. He doesn't even imagine that this man might be a detective. And then slowly they start to collaborate on this particular case, because Dr. Shepherd was one of the last people to see Roger Ackroyd alive. And we finally get to know, spoiler, if you have not read the book, I'm sorry, you should have. Dr. Shepherd was the murderer. And knowing that, if you go back to the beginning, if you read the entire novel again, what you find is that, of course, Christie is cheating you. You don't even imagine that the narrator can be the murderer, because the narrator is cooperating with the detective. The narrator is apparently faithfully presenting the entire story. So you trust the narrator. And this unreliable narrator thing is a trope which is worth looking into. It's a brilliant kind of a thing. But I kind of end up thinking that there is an element of cheating here as well, because the novelist is practically toying with us. And of course, we know that Christie was made to write this because her brother-in-law had said that we see a lot of murderers. Even the detective sometimes turns out to be the murderer. But we have never seen the narrator as a murderer. So Christie brought that within the formula, and she created this idea. But what happens is, in the entire narrative, what Dr. Shepherd does is that he never lies. He does not give you a falsehood. It's all truth. What he does is that he omits 10 minutes worth of information. 10 minutes after the murder, around the murder. Just 10 minutes. And that omission, it's not a falsehood, it's an omission. That omission makes a world of difference. And after you find it out at the end and you go back to the beginning, and if you read the novel once again, you will see that it all makes sense. The rational structure is not violated. So that is where Christie scores. Even though you might feel that she is cheating you and all that, the telephone call is a clue, and there are several clues that you are given. And so the unreliable narrator, and this is something that brings me to my point. How will Poirot prove that Dr. Shepherd is the murderer? Only a confession would work. This is my point, that the detective must get a confession, must force the culprit to confess, and that is where the narrative of the story will end. We are not concerned with how Dr. Shepherd will be punished, how his case will be presented in a court of law. If he chooses to change his confession, what concrete proof can we have? So this is the problem with the detective story, that it gives you a false sense of closure. That you think, yes, even within the fictional reality itself, you think this is fine, the detective has done his or her job, the case is solved, but the next part of punishing the culprit remains open, remains a problem. And this is something that one needs to address. This is something, as I said, the police procedurals often actually address. So perhaps in our greater consciousness of how things, of law, of detective stories, of policing, more information, we find more comfort when we know that punishment has been given. Otherwise, a simple solution, a confession by a Superman figure does not really satisfy us. And let me come to the last point, maybe 5 more minutes of your time I will take. And now when we come to the time of post-Poirot, post-Holmes, even if you look at the new Sherlock from BBC, it's not, I rewatched it a couple of days ago just because I would be speaking about it, and there was something that was troubling me. And I found out that it's just as much gimmicky as it was in Conan Doyle's time. It's gimmick, hardcore actual detection in which the detective has to find out hard evidence that is missing. These are all very good puzzles, but very bad detective stories. Very bad. I'm not going to say bad detection. I do not have the courage to say that Sherlock Holmes is a bad detective. But if you posit him, if you put him in reality, you would say that this is impossible. Byomkesh cases are much more real. They are absolutely, and of course I did not want to talk about Feluda or Mithilmashi or as such. I do not want to talk about Pandav Goenka, not in the current scenario. Primarily because children's detective stories, romances, they have a different kind of a dynamic. That's a completely different issue altogether. There are paradigm buildings, character buildings, iconic presences that are required. Colonial, post-colonial, there are a lot of complications there. I'm not going to get into that. But the final point is the detectives that we talk about. As I said, when I was thinking about the current detectives, the people that came to my mind, I mean, Robert Galbraith. For some reason, J.K. Rowling took this name, Robert Galbraith, and wrote her Cormoran Strike novels, 3 or 4 of them. I've read only a couple, in fact. Not very impressive, but not bad either. That is my personal judgment. If you are a great fan of J.K. Rowling, please do not start sending me hate mail. But the other, as I said, Precious Ramotswe I mentioned. Ngaio Marsh writes a lot of detective stories, but the most famous ones that I could think of, as I mentioned, perhaps Dalglish, Morse. These are the names that came back to me again and again. Perhaps you can help me with this. Perhaps you can mention certain other detective figures. But the thing is, remarkably, these people are no longer super. They have a lot of issues that they must negotiate. There are no supernesses. What they are, to be very brief, they are more like artists who are self-conscious, who are troubled by certain issues in their lives. I mean, yes, obviously Poirot was troubled by his past. Obviously Sherlock Holmes is troubled by his intelligence. But these people have more familiar difficulties in their lives. These people are people with whom we can kind of identify. So they become much more recognizable, much more supportable, and they are no longer, they might also be sociopaths, but they do not have the luxury of hiding behind their superness anymore. So they have money problem, they have image problems, they are often mistrusted, and they must prove themselves. They must keep on proving themselves. And there is a detective called Spencer, who is of course a private detective, whom you can kind of think of. Rebus is someone you can think of, and but the point is, these people, they must keep on proving themselves. And one detective series on television that I would suggest, the chances of most people seeing series over reading series is better, is Luther. That's a British detective series which is absolutely paradigm crushing. So you might want to see that, and that is the point, that they are within the legal paradigm or they are outside the legal paradigm. They are people who have a lot of issues. So along with the cases that they are solving, they are equally intelligent, but they have to follow due process, they have to follow the law, and they cannot just dazzle people with their genius. Because if you want to dazzle people with the genius, you need genius level crime as well. But they have to go through normal, day-to-day, but very interesting crimes. The crimes become interesting for the detective, for the figure of the detective is interesting, as well as the criminal is interesting. And the private detective, mostly male once again, they must, not only the private detective, the detective figure must go through all that in a very postmodern, troubled zone. So they are men. Because I was because I wanted to point out the gender bias in this, that is why I kept the super to man. Not man in a general human sense, but man, not superwoman, but superman. Because the woman figures were always normal in that sense, non-super in that sense. And what remains is that the element of puzzle. The puzzle is what draws us to the detective fiction, not the socio-cultural, sociological ideas like class or stuff. They are very much there. If you read Christie, you get a lot of that. But the puzzle solving and the tension that the detective might not catch, although we know very well the detective will end up catching the criminal, except in very rare circumstances, and the manipulation of the exposition, that is the narrative strategy on part of the author. But at the end of the day, it's the puzzle that the crime creates, and it's a puzzle that we enjoy, and I guess we will keep enjoying the puzzle whether the detective is super or not. Thank you so much for bearing with me for such a long time. Yes, exactly. See, you have answered your questions beautifully. That the romance of solving the puzzle, the consolation that there is this figure who will save us in a way from this moral, immoral kind of a question, that is the escape. Because as I kept saying, that the detective does not really give you a proper realistic solution. The solution that is given is a temporary solution which will probably not hold up in a court of law. So we are in a zone of romance, we are in a zone of escape, where the detective is actually giving us this sense of hope. I am not going to say false sense of hope, but a sense of hope. But this is actually one of the most interesting points about detective fiction. Thank you so much for this comment or observation. Thank you so much. The one Christie adaptation that I can think of is Shubho Mohorat, which Rituparno did, and in that it was an adaptation of The Mirror Cracked, and there is a wonderful movie with Elizabeth Taylor and a host of celebrities in England, and what we saw was that he was Indianizing it. He was creating all the, or rather he was uh, locating the entire story within Indian issues. If you think about Nandita Dash's character, if you think about all the other figures there, they were Indianized, and the whole moral scenario had to be different, because in our culture the morality, although the primary issue of motherhood denied, that had to remain the same, and the response to that, the violence that comes out because the murderer had lost her child because of this infection, the disease and the poisoning, etc. And the Miss Marple figure in this case was not a regular detective figure. She was a very intelligent old lady. She was not presented or touted as a kind of a detective figure. So the representation here, even if we look at Miss Marple and we trust her as a detective, I forget the character Rakhi played in that particular film, we would know that Rakhi would solve and save the day because we know that it's an adaptation. If we did not know that it was an adaptation, those who did not know, there must have been a lot of people. I mean, it's absolutely wrong to expect that people would know about Agatha Christie, particularly in our corner of the world. It's a very elitist thing to think that people would know about, all of the audience would know about Agatha Christie. But that kind of a change would be there. But see, Auditrik, this can be an hour's discussion, in fact. What we are living in an age of reinvention, because somehow we are incapable of creating new heroes, new paradigms, and we are going back to the old Byomkesh stories, and we are basically murdering Byomkesh each and every day with films which, I'm not going to say a lot about those films because most of the filmmakers are not unfamiliar. So, but anyway, let's just say that I do not want to comment on these adaptations, the Indian adaptations, even Feluda or such things. Within Mashi I have not seen. But with Kenneth Branagh, I told you I quite displeased. It doesn't really matter whether I am displeased or not. But personally, my personal response was that I was not happy. And in case of Death on the Nile is coming, I think, and I am quite shuddering to think what will happen there. And with the other BBC Poirot, where Poirot's origin story was completely changed, that was rather jarring. That was deeply uncomfortable. But I am sorry, I know I can't really answer your question. It's too large. It has a very large scope. But maybe we can talk about it some other time. I think this is what I have been talking about, from Super to Man, how the later detectives now, they are much more human than the superness that we associate with Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot. But your observation of the comic book thing, there is a bit of a problem because Batman is the one person who is moving from man to super. Action Comics, the Superman comics came first, where we had a Superman. In response, there was a human thing, the Batman, but after that, apart from Green Arrow or a few such, in Marvel there are a few instances perhaps. In the DC universe, I can only think of the Green Arrow as such. Maybe there are more. I do read a lot of comic books, and I am quite a comic book person. But that superhero strain has stayed with the Marvel ruling the cinematic world right now. That superhero thing had stayed, and but at the same time, these super figures have been brought down a little. They are no longer ideal super figures. They have a lot of human elements attached to them now. If you think of Captain America, they are prone to make mistakes. Superman is, well, I don't know what Superman is right now. So, but the thing is, they have been humanized much more. The Wonder Woman figure is much more humanized. We see them joking. Flash has a lot of problems, and if you look at the TV serial, then Flash has a huge lot of problems, and so on and so forth. So they are no longer the paradigms of perfection, the paradigms of superness that they originally were. And if you think about just one last example for this comment, this is a good comment, because this is something that needs addressing, because even within the super there is a paradigm of less superness. Spider-Man has become Iron Man Jr. now, because without the presence of Tony Stark, you do not have a Spider-Man now. Even the spider suit, everything about it. So apparently Spider-Man, who was a superhero in the 1960s, cannot be a superhero by himself anymore. You need to reinvent that figure, give that figure more power. Only sticking to walls is not enough anymore. Right? So this kind of devaluation has happened in case of the supermen as well. So in case of the detectives, it's much more clear. In case of the superheroes, it's a little less clear. That would be my comment. This is a good question, because this has been a sociological question for a very long time. That when Sherlock Holmes is solving a unique crime, you are also inventing that unique crime, the method of doing that, committing that unique crime. But there are no Sherlock Holmeses around us. So who knows how many perfect crimes are being committed all around us, except in politics we know the perfect crimes, but in reality the perfect crimes that are being committed all the time, we might not even know of them as such. So yes, this is a thing that, this is a question that these films, these books, they introduce new ways of committing crimes which might be adapted by people who would like to commit crimes. I mean, I do share your worry. I think I do share that along with you. But thankfully, most people are too lazy to be too innovative. So that is the one faith in humanity that I have. So that's how I think people, and the thing is, people actually become either too arrogant or they definitely end up making mistakes. So that is the one, the human incompetence is the one friend that we have in this particular case. But I do share your, I agree with you entirely. Right. I mean, if you read Conan Doyle and if you read Agatha Christie, then if you read either Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, even if you read J.K. Rowling or Robert Galbraith, you would see that there is a thing called literary flavor in these narratives. What Conan Doyle scores in is the uniqueness of the crime, uniqueness of the detective. But as most people, most critics would say, something that I personally share, as far as narrative quality, prose quality, what we call literariness is concerned, Conan Doyle lacks it a bit, but he makes up for it by leaps and bounds by the innovativeness of his narratives. We don't really read Conan Doyle for the pleasure of reading literature. We read Conan Doyle for the pleasure of solving puzzles, for reading a superhero story. Right? It's like the early comic books along with the modern graphic novels, as they are called. That now, even if you read comic books, you will see there are self-conscious literary flavors imposed on. Imposed is not the right word. The artists themselves come up with that angst. In case of Sherlock Holmes, the prose is somewhat flat. It's not a negative criticism. In fact, if anything, it kind of proves how ingenious these stories are. Even with a kind of a flat prose, these stories are still widely read. They are tremendously successful, as you say. So that would be my defense for saying slender literary merit. Absolutely. Because speaking of Christie in this level, I mentioned Tommy and Tuppence. If you read Tommy and Tuppence books, you'd see they have this thing called the Young Adventurers Limited kind of a thing. So detection becomes adventure when the detective is not only trying to prove something, but the detective figure, rather the solver figure, let's not even call him the detective figure. The detective figure has certain definitions. Robert Langdon, or to give you a very bad example from our part of the world, that Durgesh Gorrer Guptadhon kind of idea, they are not detectives as such, but they are, it's like the Indiana Jones kind of a thing, that they solve puzzles, they solve mysteries, not crimes as such. So a detective would be associated more with a specific crime and the solution of that crime, solving of that crime. But in case of Robert Langdon, the idea is to go on a much more grander epic scale, unraveling the mystery one by one, and then reaching a conclusion which may not result in the police arresting someone, which might have a different kind of ending completely. Particularly the Da Vinci Code, if you think about that, then you'd see it's a journey thing. It's more Feluda-esque. I agree entirely. Feluda is, as one of my very favorite people once told me, Feluda is travel story. You have Feluda in Kolkata very few times. Mostly you have to go to Puri, you have to go to Darjeeling, you have to go to Gangtok, and etc. so on and so forth. They are brilliant stories, but not brilliant detective stories. They are more for a younger kind of an audience. Although I enjoy reading Feluda as much as anybody else, but still the target audience is different. The target is very different. The adventure idea, that is what you associate Feluda with, or Kaka Babu with, or even Colonel Niladri Sarkar with. So that is a different kind of a thing. There are such texts in the West as well. If you think about the Hardy Boys, if you think about the famous Five, speaking of, I was talking about the unfortunate case of Pandav Goenka a few moments back. So yes, there are these adventure stories and then there are these detective stories. Often they might overlap, but mostly they remain quite separate. That would be my response.